Only mode.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's free webinar, Why Build Relationships with Grantmakers. I'll be your presenter today, Diane Leonard. I want to do just a real quick housekeeping about GoToWebinar to make sure that you get the most out of today's session so that, we all spend a lot of time online these days, but let's make sure you know how to use this platform. So when we do free webinars here at Charity How To, we get a huge audience. And so the way that we handle participation is a little bit different than in our premium webinars, where as the presenter, I'm interacting with you live and all your questions all the time. When we're in a free webinar, we do accept questions in the questions box, but I can't guarantee that I'm going to get to all of them in the short period of time that we have. So I want to highlight that for you, that please do feel free to enter them. I'll try to get to as many as I can, but unlike a premium webinar, I can't guarantee we'll get to all of them. Some other things about GoToWebinar. So what you see on your screen is a screenshot of the control panel, and you're likely listening over computer audio. Everybody's muted, but if you have any warbles, it might very well be an internet thing, and so you could click on that radio button that says phone call. A phone number will pop up, and you'll be able to dial in. I also want to make sure you know that today's session is being recorded. The slides and the recording will be in your Charity How To library tomorrow so that you can access them. The slides are already there, but the recording will show up tomorrow morning as long as we don't have any tech glitches, and you'll be able to access both at your convenience. Let's see. What else? I think that's probably about it. So I am thrilled that you've taken time to join me for this session today. And I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to turn my webcam on so that you can see me because, well, what's one of the things that we've learned about being remote, being online so much? What we've learned is that seeing each other face to face is really important for our relationship building, isn't it? And so I've turned my camera on. Actually, it's one of the embedded cameras. Not even sure what's happening right now, but that's okay. Let's just go with it. It'll still give me a chance to feel more connected to you as we talk about today's conversation, which is why build relationships with grantmakers. So here's just a little bit about me. I am a GPC, a grant professional certified. That's through the Grant Professional Certification Institute, an associate affiliated organization of the Grant Professionals Association. I'm also one of about 40 approved trainers for the Grant Professionals Association. And let's just put it out there right now. Neither of those things guarantees that we get the grant every time. My, how I wish that it did. But what it does mean is that I love talking about best practices in our work as grant seekers, as grant professionals, as nonprofit professionals. And so I'm thrilled that you've joined me as today we talk about the very specific best practices related to relationship building with grantmakers. Okay, just a few other things because each of us has our own unique winding path that brings us into grants. Mine is that I started as a grant maker. So I was on the other side of the grant seeking equation, and it was hard. There were always more great requests than there were dollars available, and there were always phone calls being received and emails coming into my inbox from organizations doing great things that wanted to talk to me, that wanted to get my perspective about their competitiveness. They wanted to build a relationship with me as a program officer as a way to build a greater relationship with the organization as a whole. So I have been in both sets of shoes, the funder who people are trying to build relationships with, and then for the years since as a grant seeker. Now, as we look at what is going on, I just want a quick check-in. It seems like maybe we're having some audio issues. I'm checking in. If you can hear me, give me a quick Y in the questions box so that I know that you can hear me. I know we've got a few folks having some problems. Oh, good. Thanks for that. For those of you that quick responded. I always get nervous when I see audio issues. That also proves I'm watching that questions box live, aren't I? So if you do have a question, You definitely go ahead and ask. I'll do my best to answer as many as I can before our time is up today. I want to be conscious of the time box you have committed to me today. I'm happy also to answer questions on Twitter after the fact, or on LinkedIn, or LinkedIn messages, or, well, anywhere that you're willing to ask me a question about grants, I'm happy to answer. So you'll have my contact information at the end. So what are we going to cover in our short period of time together today? Everything about relationships. That is our entire focus today. But we need to understand the context of today's sole focus. Our context is that relationships are one part of the grant life cycle. So on the screen right now, I have an image of the grant life cycle. And the way that our team describes it is with 5 R's. Quick show of hands in the questions box for me. Y for yes, N for no. How many of you have heard of or thought of the grant life cycle in the way that it's visualized on the screen for you right now? Y for yes, N for no. No judgment here either way. This is an image that our team created, but it's based in best practices that the grant professionals' competencies are focused on, that the Grant Professionals Association professional development is focused on. So we just haven't always given it this name. So I'm giving you some shared language for us to use today when I talk about the grant life cycle. There are 5 elements. We start at the top just like we would reading a clock. We look at readiness first. When we look at readiness, we're thinking about whether or not our organization is ready to apply. Could we be competitive? Are we dotting all our I's, crossing all our T's in terms of being ready? That's what we're looking at there. And then we move on. Once we've got that housekeeping done, we think about research. So who do we want to have fund us, whether foundations or government? The third R, as we move clockwise around our life cycle, is relationships, where we're going to spend our time today. Then, because we've talked to a funder or tried to have a contact established, we're going to dig in on our writing, use what we've learned through research and relationships to customize our writing work to write as competitive a proposal as possible. And then finally, because we do it all so well, we get to happy dance because we got the grant award, and it's time to do grant reporting. Then it starts all over again. Never a dull moment in grants. So this is the context that I'm talking about relationship building in. You might hear me reference other elements of our life cycle, but the reason why today's conversation is so important is that relationship building of the 5 elements here in our life cycle is the one that well-intentioned, well-managed organizations, that great grant professionals doing wonderful writing work, when under the pressure of grant calendars and deadlines, might skip over, might overlook, might shortchange in terms of the time and effort spent with board members or with other stakeholders. This is an area where we can really dial up our efforts in terms of increasing our competitiveness. So to think about this idea of why relationships with grantmakers are important, I'd like to have you participate in a quick exercise with me. I would like for you to pretend that it is the end of your workday. Please do not shut down your computer. Please do not go away. I'll get in trouble with supervisors all over the country. Don't do it. We're just pretending for a minute. It's the end of your workday. And so whether you're working remotely or you're in the office, you are wrapping up for the day, you head to your personal mailbox. And what do you find? Bills, magazine or newspaper, maybe a wedding invitation, maybe a birth announcement, and also a solicitation from a nonprofit in your own community. It is addressed directly to you. It has a real stamp. It is not bulk nonprofit mail. It has a real stamp. And in this solicitation, that nonprofit has asked you for $250. You have never given to this organization. You've not gone to any of their events. You weren't on their mailing list before. You're not sure, how did you get this solicitation? Let me know in the questions box, what do you do in response to this solicitation? Candid answer. Promise, #no judgment. What do you do with this solicitation that comes to you directly personally, but from a nonprofit in your own community that you are not currently engaged with. Let's find out what happens here. Okay, yeah. These are nice, candid answers. Thank you. This is about what normally happens. Ignore it, or delete it, or recycle it, toss it, maybe read it, but likely not give. A few say, oh, might give if personally moved by the mission. I see someone who says, oh, Deanna says, read it and think about it. Okay, that's great. A few of you are admitting that because it's local, you recognize their address, that you might give it a little bit of thought. I don't see the comment, but what the other thing that might happen is you realize one of your friends is on that board or committee list on the letter you've received. And you're like, oh, I didn't know Pamela. Oh, I didn't know that Jonathan. I didn't know they were on the board. Oh, that explains why I got it. I think I'll hold on to it. Maybe I'll give them $25 or something, right? We might be personally connected to that list on the letterhead and choose to make a gift for that reason as well. Okay, so what does that tell us? How does that help us think about grant makers? If you approach a grant maker and directly apply without any sort of contact, might they feel as surprised or maybe jilted by what they receive when you request funding? Pause here for deep thought. They might feel similarly to how you did when you opened that theoretical solicitation from your own mailbox. And here's why. Now, it certainly is not all grant makers are going to feel that way. But if a grant maker has any capacity or preference for relationship building, if they're willing to read your email, if they're willing to talk to you to answer any questions you have, and if they've made that public, we're willing to answer questions. Reach out via this info email if you have any questions about our process. If they've offered that and you reach out with an application, you reach out with a solicitation, and there's been no contact, they may also go, I wonder where they heard about us. I wonder where they decided that we would be a competitive good fit. It doesn't mean that similarly to how you could take that solicitation and put it straight to your recycling bin, put it straight into your trash, it didn't mean that they necessarily can do that. They still have to log that they received it, process it via their normal protocols, whatever that might be for the funder. But it doesn't start things off on the right foot. We want our grant makers to be excited as they receive our work. We don't want to in any way have a little bit of friction in the way that they receive our request. And so what this comes back to is a question, a comment, a quote, I should say, from a colleague of mine, Heather Stombob, who, as you can see after her name, is a GPC, so grant professional certified like me, but also a CFRE, so a certified fundraising executive, which means that Heather doesn't just think about grants. Heather thinks about all fundraising. And Heather had this line, used it a few years ago, people give to people, not proposals. Like, yeah, that's pretty universal as a statement. And you might think that that is driven towards major donors, individual donors. But the reality is, you could, I argue, say people grant to people, not proposals. So if we're going to think about the fact that it's people reading our proposal, making choices about whether or not they're going to advocate for you, whether or not they're going to open their checkbook, that's right. We need to think about all of our opportunities to build a relationship and what it is that we might be able to do to influence that. Part of why we build relationships with grant makers is it helps take the black and white text of the guidelines, of the website, the very strict language that might be used about the guidelines, it might give us a little peek, maybe just a little bit, into what is important to this grant maker. What are some of their favorite success stories? What is it that's motivating their release of this opportunity? What is it that motivates their funding? What is driving them? Each grant maker is really different. In fact, I'm thinking back, I'm totally in a time warp moment. I'm thinking back to an article Allison Shirk published way back in 2018, true story, for the Philanthropy News Digest. And her title was, "So You Know One Foundation, ... So You Know One Foundation," or something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but the idea is each grant maker, each foundation is so different in their motivation. We need to understand each grant maker's motivation, their drive, what really gets them excited, so that we can tell our story in our writing or in our typing and have our most competitive application. Still not convinced? Okay, maybe it's that you're like, "Diane, I already know this." Sometimes, though, it's that we have to convince or sell the idea about relationship building. Sometimes we need to give a little nudge or boost to our board members or our committee members or our fellow employees that we're asking to talk to a grant maker at a conference or at a meeting. So I'm arming you hopefully with some ideas for how it is that you can talk about why relationships are important with your colleagues. So here's information from another well-respected colleague in the field, Vanessa Chase Lockshin, who runs the storytelling nonprofit, talks about why we tell stories. Now, if we think about stories, we might be using them as a way to connect the grant makers, the individuals running the grant making organizations, to what our organization is trying to do. But how do we know which story is important? How do we know whether it should be a client story or if it should be a staff story or a community story? How do we know if we don't try to talk to the grant maker first? We'd be guessing. We might be sort of throwing darts, blindfolded, at a dartboard. So let's think about the types of stories we might tell and why. So why would relationships with grant makers be important? Because our grant makers have a mission, something they're trying to achieve with their funding, just like our nonprofit organization, our grant-seeking organization has a mission that it's trying to achieve as well. So by finding those points of connection, by finding the parallel mission, we're able to achieve so much impact together. Now you might say, what is this example from social media have to do with this deeper idea, why relationships are important? When we think about why people are giving to people, why are people granting to people? They are feeling connected to the cause. They're trying to achieve their mission and their impact. So I've got here for you an example of what one organization did that helped build relationships. And actually, it wasn't just with one grant maker, it was actually with multiple stakeholders. So when we think about why relationships with grant makers are important, all of our relationships are important, whether we're talking about one $5 monthly donor or a $100,000 grant maker. They are all relationships that help drive our organization. So sometimes we can have a great opportunity to engage and say positive things about these relationships. And this is such an example. Save the River, a small yet mighty staff in the Thousand Islands in far, far, far upstate New York, right where I'm based, they had a matching grant that they received. And this was a grant maker that they had a long-term funding relationship and partnership with. And in order to get that matching grant, part of it they understood was about the drive of the grant maker. They wanted to see sustainability. They wanted to see how would programs and projects continue, or was it going to be dependent for this project or program on their dollars? So because they understood not only about this one specific grant maker's passion for the Thousand Islands, for the environment, for engaging the next generation, the students you see in the photos, in environmental education, but they knew it was about sustainability. reaching other supporters, they were able to craft messaging and thank yous that showed the grantmaker, look at all the different ways, not only are we meeting and exceeding your matching grant, but that we are engaging our other stakeholders. And I like this story for so many reasons, because it's thinking about the why for the grantmaker in the moment, as well as their bigger mission. It's showing how one story that's going to impact potentially a relationship with a grantmaker can be carried out even if with a small staff, because they took the one story and then used it across different platforms. They took the same content and reshaped it in a few different ways. So this to me is a great story that highlights why understanding a grant maker, why taking the time to build a relationship, if they have capacity and preference, which again, elephant in the room, I understand not all grant makers have, but if they have that capacity or preference, this is why the relationships are so important. Otherwise, a well-intentioned group like Save the River, they might have simply kept asking for programmatic support money in a traditional way, and all of a sudden been surprised when it came as a denial one day. Instead, because they understood the bigger picture focus on sustainability, they were able to continue nurturing the relationship. That's a win for me. I think that's a win for them too. What does this get to? It gets to the idea of next level gratitude. And this is a quote, not from me, this is a quote straight from a grant maker. So let's think about next level gratitude as defined by my friend and colleague, Max Del Senor. He's the assistant director for the Northern New York Community Foundation. But this is not a feeling or a quote that's limited only to one community foundation. This is something that's felt by grant makers everywhere. Gratitude has no boundaries. As a grantee, extending a thank you beyond the report can carry tremendous value with a funder. I know, everyone's like, Diane, forehead slap sort of moment. Really? This is a quote we're going to share from a grant maker? I know, it's so basic, isn't it? It really is. But why, if it's that basic, as I say it out loud, that you're nodding along, you're like, yeah, okay, why am I talking about it? Because grant makers aren't feeling this. Let's be frank for a moment, if we could here. Okay, yeah, we're still recording, but it's just us for a minute. When we are under the pressure of a very full grant calendar, when we're maybe feeling a huge increase in demand for the volume of what we have to do, I don't know, say maybe because of a pandemic. I think a lot of us have felt that as grant pros lately. We need to get the applications out the door by the deadline so they can be considered. We need to get the reports in by the dates that they're due so we build and continue to have funding opportunities. Do we always have time for this idea of next level gratitude? Sometimes it's what we might have to set down in terms of priorities. So we know it is important, but does it always rise to the top of our to-do list in terms of a priority that needs to get carved out? That's where I think sometimes we struggle. How can we still get this done when we know if we drop any of the other things that we're juggling, we're going to have a bigger problem? So you're right. The grant maker relationships are so important, but we've got this one elephant over here I already mentioned. Not all grant makers have capacity or preference to talk to us in advance. And then we have, I don't know, 4, 5, 10 elephants over here that are the demands on us as the grant writer and grant professional to manage the whole life cycle when we know that our organizations need resources more than ever, and we might be feeling the pressure of that increased volume that I just mentioned. So I get it. I hear you. I'm acknowledging all these elephants around this. And this is why when we look at that life cycle, I said this is the spot where we can really fine tune our grant seeking efforts in order to be more competitive, to secure more dollars. Because just like with individual donors, where it is more expensive to secure a new donor than to keep an existing donor, it is certainly, I'd argue, more expensive for an organization to get a new grant maker in the door than to maintain the funding relationship with someone they already have received funding from. So with that, let's switch gears. I've gotten on the soapbox about why relationships with grantmakers are so important. Again, not because necessarily you needed to be convinced, but because sometimes you need to be armed with different examples or ideas or comebacks or quotes in order to help engage and motivate your colleagues to help. Because last time I checked, well, I'm just me. Still just one person, and there is a limit to my own capacity. And so sometimes I'm going to have to ask for help, either because someone might know someone better than I might, or have closer connections, or I literally just need some help with some of the grant life cycle items in order to work at a sustainable pace and not be burned out. So if we take that idea of a sustainable pace and capacity, let's put it on the grantmakers now for a minute. How do we know what a grantmaker's capacity or preference is for relationship building? What does it look like? Has anyone, give me a show of hands in the questions box, has anyone ever reached out to a grantmaker that they weren't sure was going to want to hear from them? They weren't sure they were going to answer your call. You weren't sure if they were going to respond to your email. Go ahead and let me know if you've tried. You've given it the old school try on the chance that it could happen. Oh, good. All right. I'm seeing yeses with exclamation points. Some of you are saying all the time. All the high fives and all the gold stars for you. That's tough because it might be, well, an effort that doesn't result in a conversation, but we have to try. What we also need to do is make sure that when we or fellow colleagues are doing research about new potential funding opportunities, we need to make sure that we're looking for clues that help us understand anything we can about a grantmaker's capacity or preference. We'll still give it the good old try if we find nothing. But what are some of the things we might be finding in their websites or their materials? So here's just a few quick examples. So as we look at the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan, one of the things that I really liked about their website when I looked at it was the fact that they said, as a potential partner, you simply need to read these guidelines, simply. And then if you think there's a fit, please call and talk to us. Okay, so that's pretty clear on capacity and preference, isn't it? Please go old school. Please call us. Anybody want to weigh in on the questions box? Why do you think they asked for you to call in an age where email is everything to us, where our inboxes have so much information? Why do you think that they would say, please call? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Go ahead. Shorthand, quick answer in the questions box. While you're sharing your thoughts on that, let me share this last line here. This is really the zinger. We value your time and do not want you to spend unnecessary hours and resources preparing a proposal unless there's a clear possibility of us working together. Wow. Oh, thank you, dear Grantmaker, for seeing us. We want that too, right? We don't want to apply to you if it's not going to be a good fit, not a good exercise for anyone. So why then, if that's their statement, if that's what they feel, why are they asking for us to call? Okay, yes, they value relationships. It values that. It does take more time and commitment for you to call. And so that in itself is showing your commitment to the potential funding partnership. It's showing up front that you can follow directions. David, I agree. Oh, Christine, want to connect with your story and want to know more. Yes. Ooh, Amy, can have a true and personal dialogue. Absolutely. Deanna, able to ask a question. All of these together, and there's more than I can even read here. You're right on point. By being able to talk, you'll be able to hear their inflection. Interesting. The pregnant pause in itself says a lot. There's no pregnant pause in email. I guess maybe unless you put in a few extra hard returns, but it doesn't have the same impact as listening to a funder pause and have sort of a, hiccup, a in their response. What they're about to do is save you a whole bunch of time. But it really does give them a chance to answer questions because I don't know about you. Sometimes I write emails and I'm like, that is so crystal clear. Best thing I've written all week. And then the feedback comes from your colleagues and you're like, or not. Maybe it was more of a caffeinated email than a super clear email. Either way. So when they ask us to call, they're really providing us a great opportunity. So now something that I see in the comments box here coming in the questions, Kara says, I email foundations to connect and set up a meeting. But sometimes I can only find their phone number. Is it appropriate to cold call a foundation for a potential connection? It seems more bothersome than an email. This is a widely debated approach. I absolutely do understand that by emailing a foundation to ask for a time to talk, it does feel more respectful of their time. I mean, do they have time to answer the phone right now? I don't know. Just because it's good for me doesn't mean it's good for them. You're right. But their inbox, to someone's earlier point, their inbox is overflowing. Well, I don't have the scientifically perfect answer for us here because it's all still us as people working together. But here tends to be why I still say that a cold call, trying a call and leaving a voicemail is a good effort. If you don't get a call back, then you could try an email asking. So here's why, Kara, and everyone else. I want you to think about how many emails you received yesterday. So let's see, today's Tuesday, right? Day of the week, Tuesday. So yesterday, Monday, people were back at work, and so a lot of things are happening. Everybody's excited for the week, digging in. Ballpark, how many emails did you get? Go ahead and type it in the questions box for me. How many emails did you get? I always stop counting the day before a relationship webinar because I always count. And then I say, well, I'll stop counting at 100. I always have to stop counting. But then, oh yeah, too many. Ooh, wow, Daniel, 240. I think we might be competing. All right. Not the right kind of competition I want to have, but I'm like, that's a lot. Now type in the answer. How many voicemails did you get? My phone actually rang a lot yesterday, so my number is unusual. Our physician's office got a new phone system. So everyone in my household got an automated phone call telling us that there were new phone systems, 4 voicemails. I got 1 real work voicemail yesterday though, but I was like, oh, my count is off today because of this weird auto thing from the physician's office. An anomaly. 1 real work voicemail. I see a lot of you that said 0. Ooh, Daniel, my 240 email response, 0 voicemail. Funders have the same type of ratios. And so if they can answer, they might. If they can return the voicemail, you're actually more likely to have them respond to that 1 or 2 voicemails than the hundreds of emails. So it's worth the shot. And then you make a note on the calendar. You've left a respectful voicemail. If you didn't get to someone, and if the call doesn't get returned, you could follow up via email in 4 or 5 days. Sure. That's my favorite way to handle it. Okay, went down a rabbit hole there on the email voicemail thing, but thanks for playing along. So let's look at a few other things here. When we look at capacity, we've got online systems and eligibility quizzes, and what does that often leave us? Okay, a different path if we have technical problems than if we have actual application or guideline questions. So let's watch for what sort of path they're sending us on. It's sort of like a choose your own adventure book. I'm way back in the time warp machine again, but depending on what type of question might dictate where we go. So let's watch for that so we're respecting the process that the Grantmaker has in place. When we think about that idea, here again, we see different types of questions going in different directions. We see hyperlinks to emails and phone numbers. If we've got both here, what would we do? Well, per the storyline that we just played out, phone first, email as a follow-up. gives us that chance to have the real dialogue, to answer and ask follow-up questions, to hear the inflection in their voice. Now listen, I have to say this one. Here you go. You ready? I hope your foreheads are going to have a little mark here. At least mine will. Another forehead moment where you're like, we know this? Funders often say in their materials, if you have a question not addressed in our frequently asked questions, then you may contact us. Why do they say that? Because they get questions all the time that are already answered in their frequently asked questions. And what does that do in terms of making a good first impression with a grant maker? Not a good thing, not a good step. So I get that it says it here on the website, but just for the cheap seats in the back so that we all hear, we all agree. And maybe this isn't directed at you. Maybe this is something you need to help educate your colleagues about, or your new intern, or a well-intentioned colleague. You need to make sure that if anyone else in your organization is reaching out to a grant maker, that they personally, not just you, but that they personally have read those FAQs so that they're not asking questions that are answered there before you reach out. I know, right? It's really more about having an issue with like who's reaching out, how much have we read, how much have we prepped them. So when we think about our outreach, all of these websites, all of our research provide us with different clues. Here we've got an orientation. This one I found to be interesting. That way you get a complete overview of the process, an opportunity to ask questions. Well, this is really thoughtful. This is from a foundation. It feels different than maybe a governmental pre-conference or pre-proposal type session. I was in one of those today. 2 hours. They read the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint was really just a copy and paste from the RFP. Not really a strong orientation, but technically an opportunity to ask questions. So we go because it might help you learn something. This really felt more relationship driven coming from a specific grant maker. Okay, when we think about our emails or our phone calls, and we think about who it is that we're reaching, we've seen different titles, we've seen info emails, we've seen direct emails. Does it matter who we're really talking with at the organization? It's rare that we're going to get to the person that has the final authorization about our application and will get to make that go, no-go decision. Usually it's a committee or a board or a few individuals who are making this decision. When we think about our org charts for our foundations, our grant makers that we're reaching out to, I want to encourage you to be open to conversations with any individual that has been deemed the person who can answer the phone calls, answer the emails. They are serving as the gatekeeper. We can't tell from looking at their org charts, unless they have directly told us in their materials, like a few did, who are our gatekeepers. So anyone that answers, anyone that will email us back is a great place to start the relationship. In fact, part of where I first really thought deeply about this was back when I was a grant maker. Verlina, who was our office manager, had been there longer than anyone else on staff. And Verlina would answer every phone call that came in and knew all sorts of information and was an incredible resource if I wasn't available or Peg, our CEO, wasn't available. All sorts of great information. So you just never know who the great gatekeeper that you will get to build a relationship with and get answers from, where that will be on the org chart. Now, how does that play out with our preferences? Well, we've seen in our website, this is a preference. We prefer the phone. Actually, the Southeast Michigan Community Foundation took it a step further, and they took that one line about value and actually had a whole letter directly written to grantees. It was awesome. Awesome. This whole thing feels like the type of relationship and respect that Vule, I don't know if anyone knows Vule of Nonprofit AF, who really is up on the soapbox about trying to change the balance of this unequal relationship between grant makers and grant seekers. I get it, it's there. But the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan really was trying to respect, what do we have here? We've got money, but you have great programs. We both need each other. Right? It doesn't have to be grant maker to grant seeker. When we look at our materials and we're thinking about our online quizzes, I wanted to have you participate here in one more activity with me. You've been answering all sorts of great questions here in the questions box. Let's see how you do on this last one. This is the Philadelphia Foundation. And what happens here is that if you want general operating support, you must, if you're a first-time applicant, you must contact the staff. They tell you have to do the eligibility quiz, and there's some other resource materials. But what if you, as the grant seeker, are interested in the organizational effectiveness grants? By looking at the Grantmakers' other materials, their other funding streams, you happen to see the general operating funding where they must be contacted if you're a first-time applicant. Here they say 5-minute quiz, and then you can apply. Do you reach out or not? Go ahead, Y for yes, N for no. If you're somewhere in the middle, I'll take an M or a question mark. That's okay too. But let's have you weigh in. What are you going to do? This is a real world thing. This happens to us, right? We look at grant makers that have multiple funding streams. So what are we going to do? Are there right or wrong singular answers here? There's room for interpretation in all of these. But the resounding answer, there's some of you that are in the middle on it, and I'm okay with that. But I agree that it is worth trying to talk to them because we see that there is capacity. Preference is questionable here, but we know there's capacity for communication in other funding programs that they run. So what I'm really testing here is, do they have capacity to answer questions? But I'd like to some of your points, I want to make sure before I do that, I've done all my homework, I've taken the quiz, I know what questions I'm going to have. Basically, I have my talking points ready. That way, when we reach out, okay, we're having a good conversation. This one, I love this quote, this particular line. If you feel there is an extraordinary request, your reason should be considered. Please contact us. Who gets to decide on extraordinary? That one's interesting. I'm not picking on this one. This is a very geographically focused foundation. Geographic preference. Key reason, proposals are quickly denied by a grant maker. So they're telling you, like, if you're outside of the support area, you're not going to proceed. But I thought that was interesting. You can contact us if you think that you are like the exception. It's never good to feel like the exception or the outlier. It's really hard to win that argument with a grant maker. So I don't know that I'd really feel very optimistic about this opportunity to contact the grant maker. This one to me is more like no, we'll set it down. So as we look at all of these different ways that we're reaching out, what is the common denominator behind all of these? Whether it's email, whether it's the phone call, what is our common denominator? It's being prepared, doing our homework for what we think is the grant maker's motivation so that we can have this great conversation. Or at least make the initial inquiry. It might not be a great conversation the first time. It may be very short as an interaction. But why do we want to have these conversations? It's because it gives us an advantage. And it's actually a foundation that doesn't have capacity or preference that gives us the clue of what an advantage it can be. The grant maker, in this case, the Cummings Foundation out of Buffalo, New York, recognizes that any relationship building conversation is going to advantage an applicant, going to give him a slight edge. So since they don't have capacity and or preference, they just don't. And they apply it uniformly. They can't talk to everybody, so they talk to no one. That way, they have leveled the playing field as best they can control. We could definitely get into other equity conversations here. I completely agree. But their point is by not talking, by not having these conversations, they are not further creating a gap between the types of applicants that they might be funding. So I appreciate and respect their very clear position. Our common denominator is we build relationships. We prepare, we create talking points, and we reach out. We want to share our story. Why is it that we think that this grantmaker is a good fit with us? Why do we think it's going to be a great funding partnership? That answer is different for each and every grantmaker we will look at. So we need to walk through our talking points, prepare ourselves for that phone call, or prepare our CEO or our board member or our vice president of development. Whoever it is that's reaching out, we need to help build those talking points, practice with them, make sure they feel comfortable, ensure that they've read those frequently asked questions, and then get people on the phone, get the email sent so that we can do our best to start the relationships. Now, we are at the end of our time together today. In fact, I think I've gone probably 2 minutes over the time box. I get so impassioned about relationship building, I just can't help it sometimes. So I want to make sure that you know that you can reach out with questions. You can reach out on social media. You can come to my website and drop me a note there in the contact us, whatever works. Absolutely happy to talk more with you offline. I also, as a thank you for being here with us today, for participating in the questions box, maybe even laughing at one of my mom jokes or one of my puns. If you want to join us for one of our premium grant webinars, there's bonus materials. I answer every question you have before we leave the session. Please feel free to use my last name, Leonard, all caps, and get 15% off any of our upcoming grant writing webinars. I'd love to have you participate in any of our upcoming sessions because you've been delightful to go back and forth within the questions box today, and I'd love to talk with you more about grant seeking best practices in your work. Oh, thank you everyone so much again for being with us, for talking relationships with me today. I hope you've got some different ideas for how you might approach relationship building or how you're going to help your colleagues really embrace this idea and become a capacity boost for yourself as well. Please feel free to reach out with questions, as I mentioned, anywhere I am, LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever you're comfortable. I'm happy to answer those questions, and I hope to see you in a future webinar with us. Have a great day.